Okay, welcome to the end and also the beginning of the product life cycle of the garment. We've made it through the 7 previous stages. The customer has purchased the garment, they've used the garment numerous times, presumably they've washed the garment, and now they're ready to be rid of the garment. So the end of life of a garment in the past or traditionally meant that the garment was thrown away or it was used as a rag, and that was it. Sometimes it was given to the Salvation Army, as per the picture below. But we're going to see now that under a holistic model, there's a few more options that we can take, that we need to take indeed, as a result of this. Okay, a little bit of economics. You may have done this in secondary school at some point. Adam Smith's circular flow model, The Wealth of Nations, where he came up with, or he studied the way in which markets operated in his native Scotland, and he came up with a theory to explain economics. And basically, it was that companies produce goods, which they sell to households. Households pay for those goods by going and working for the company. So you get this nice, neat circular model occurring with consumption and expenditure happening from the household and then the company paying wages, rent, or dividends to those households. So the economic model is nice and neat and contained and can go on forever as it has been. The problem that this model doesn't take into account is what happens when those goods and services are finished, when the customer no longer wants them. The question is, where is that garbage? If we go to the promise of the great acceleration, so this is what the circular flow model looks like in terms of goods and services. Do you remember the Americans after World War II introduced this model based on consumption? So you get a nice fridge, you fill it full of food. As your income goes up, perhaps you get a bigger fridge and you get better food or more expensive food. You get a washing machine to do all the cleaning so you can go out and have a coffee during the day. And then on your weekends, you might take the whole family for a drive. And when you're finished with these products, then you get rid of them. And the form they take when you get rid of them is garbage. And this is where the problem is. Up until now, when there was a minority of the world's population that was living this high materialistic lifestyle, the garbage wasn't too bad. The problem now is the garbage is getting much bigger. I'm going to introduce you to another theory at this stage, the Gaia hypothesis, that was formulated by James Lovelock. Lovelock was a NASA scientist who discovered the hole in the ozone layer, amongst other work he did for NASA at that stage. But basically, he came up with this hypothesis that suggests that you should see the Earth as a living organism. So if I compare it to a person here, I'll see if I can explain it this way. If this is a human being, if, for instance, let's say the hand of the human being gets cut off, then the body adapts, heals, and keeps functioning. What if the whole arm gets cut off, gets caught up in an accident or something, or rots or whatever? The body, once again, it will heal itself and continue. But at some point, the more damage you inflict on this human body, at some point, the human body will tip. There'll be a tipping point, and it will cease to function, or it will commence a downward sort of spiral and eventually die. Lovelock suggests that the Earth isn't, a forest in New South Wales or a river system in China. He says that the Earth is one big living organism. It's alive. And then when you start dumping things on it, you in fact start to infect it. And the more you do that, the more you damage this system. And at some point, according to his theory, it will tip into a different state, and a state that he suggests is not habitable for human beings. And that, again, is where our problem lies. How much can we afford to damage the Earth before the Earth changes? So keep that in mind as we go forward. So in other words, you wouldn't eat this because it would make you sick, yet when we put garbage into the Earth, we expect the Earth to process that garbage or eat that garbage. And the assumption is it's making the Earth sick, as well as us anyway. So let's have a look at it from a linear point of view or a traditional point of view. Um, what did you do with garbage? What did countries do with garbage in the past? You just dig a big hole. Very simple. You chuck it in, and then when it fills up, you cover it over, and usually you plant a few trees and some grass. And so this image on the right here of this park is in Northcote, right next to the Northcote Shopping Centre, Northcote Plaza. So if you're familiar with that area, you've got this nice shopping centre which overlooks a nice park where people play. Underneath that, in the 1980s, that was a pretty big garbage tip for the northern suburbs of Melbourne. So it's kind of out of sight, out of mind. What's underneath the soil here is possibly toxic. Not possibly, it is. It's toxic. Um, we don't know where it's going. It could be going into the water system or contaminating other parts of the earth. But again, it's an example of how we sort of close our eyes and only look at the surface and say, oh, what a beautiful park, without necessarily caring or wanting to know how the whole ecosystem in that area works. A bit like this guy. He's cutting the limb, remember from week one, that's holding him up. Totally naive as to what's going on because, hey, the park looks nice. So just give you another example of that. If we look at it on the right, you've got this image of a pretty typical Melbourne suburb. Most of the citizens in this street have been responsible and have put out their garbage. And as you can see, it's quite a nice, aesthetically pleasing street. Everyone keeps it clean. And we get a sense, a positive sense when we drive down this street or when we walk or live in this street. We think, oh, it's nice. It's a nice neighbourhood. But if we look beyond what we just see in front of us and we ask ourselves, well, where does the garbage go? It goes to places like this on the left. And in this case, I think by memory, this was in Lagos, in Nigeria, in Africa. And it gets dumped there. Why? Because it's an undeveloped country. They don't have much money. And so they accept the money that Australia or other countries may offer in exchange for dumping their waste in that country. And in terms of this picture here, what they're also doing, these kids are doing, is removing the copper from the wires in the computer. And the easiest way to do that, because you can recycle the copper so they can earn some money from it. The easiest way to do that is to just melt the plastic off. So they start a fire, burn the computer, and when it dies out, they go and strip all the copper out of there. Problem with it is that those plastics, as you can see by the black smoke, is incredibly toxic. So if you start breathing in parts of that, it's not good for your health. But here's the problem. We in the developed world don't see it. We see a nice clean neighbourhood and we don't see the consequences of our garbage. Out of sight, out of mind. But that's starting to become a problem because the world is getting smaller. If you recall our economic development model, hunter-gatherer, agriculture, etc., we're currently in the information age, an age of interconnectivity. We have, through the various social platforms, the apps we've got, the Facebooks, WhatsApp, etc., allows us to send images and messages instantly. It allows messages to potentially go viral within minutes, if not hours or days. And what it means is that if we do get an image like that, or if one citizen on Earth sees an image like that and puts it online, it doesn't take long before the whole world sees it. So, we go from being basically in the past hunter-gatherer agriculture stage of economic development, where we've sort of been blind to a lot of the consequences of our actions, to a world now where we can actually see everything that's happening, or a significant amount of what's happening. And this is causing us to freak out, a bit like this orangutan down there. It's like, oh my God, the world's in a mess. So, remembering as the economic structure changes over time, if you recall, the business had to change. So in hunter-gatherer stage, the fashion business model was to make clothes out of leather. In the agricultural stage, the fashion business model was to make clothes out of agricultural products, hemp, um, rice, etc., cotton. Industrialization, mass production. When you get to the information age, what does that have to do with a fashion brand? It's information about how that garment is created, who made the garment, how much were they paid, what chemicals and inputs and other inputs were used to create that garment, and what happens to the garment once it's thrown away. So now, a brand that does not address these issues, which does not have a transparent, open supply chain to explain this to their customers, is a brand that is potentially going to be perceived as being sneaky, out of date, or untruthful. All of those attributes can damage the brand. So because of this context, we've got to be, or take into consideration, what we do with our garbage. A couple of years ago, China announced that they would no longer accept garbage from the United States, Western Europe, Australia, etc. Basically from the developed world, the guys that live up at the top of the tree. China said, no more. So up until that point, China was buying the garbage, or excuse me, China was being paid to accept the garbage from these countries, and in China they would process it, sort it out, recycle what they could, and what they couldn't, they would just dump into their own garbage tip. It was so it was partly economic action by China, who now, as their standard of living increases, they no longer need to accept garbage as a source of income from other countries. But it was also a symbolic position that China took. China was basically saying, as a developing country, which is sort of here but moving up quite quickly, China was basically saying, we're not going to accept the garbage from the richest countries on earth. Let them deal with their own garbage. And that was quite a shock announcement. It happened immediately in a very short period of time. And it left a lot of countries, in particular Australia, with a real problem. They did not have a process or an industry that could handle garbage. So the garbage started to store up, such as in the case, as I said, of Australia, where, again, this was 2 years ago, but these recycling centres were discovered to be nothing more than just storage centres, or in effect, garbage tips. Because there was no industry here, there was no incentive to recycle, there was no capacity to recycle. And so it just heightened the issue that the developed world generates a lot of garbage, but up until recently weren't prepared to deal with the garbage. They said, let's find a developed country and let them deal with it. No longer the case. If, excuse me, have a look at this slide. This is a slide of a trust index. Now, this is how citizens in different countries of the world, to what extent they trust their institutions. And institutions are things like governments, the police department, universities, hospitals, any public institution that influences our lives. And in 2016, roughly it was about 50% of the world trusted their institutions. China was way up the top with 73% of its citizens trusting their government. And Australia was sitting at 49%. Fast forward one more year to 2017, and you find China slipping from 73 to 67. This is as Chinese citizens become more educated, are exposed to more of the activities of their government and other institutions, and they start to trust a little bit less. Australia, again, went from 49% down to, where are we, 42%. So what we start to see by and large in many countries of the world is, interesting here is Japan. Japan's pretty much slight decrease, but pretty much on a par, consistent. Uh, why this is important to us is that if the general trend in a society is that they no longer believe and don't trust institutions, it also means that they may not trust a brand and what that brand represents. And as you know from your marketing, a brand recognition is where the value is in a company, or a significant portion of the value of a company is how much it's believed. So a society that has um, a lowering level of trust is not going to believe you. So as a fashion brand, to keep your customers' trust, you've got to be honest with them, or perhaps adopt some sort of approach of honesty. And I'll look at that in a bit more detail in a few minutes. Okay, two worlds. Let's have a look at this in terms of how we deal with the garbage from this two-world perspective. In the developed world, if we do process garbage here, or store garbage here, I should say, it's a capital-intensive process, which is represented by this image on the right, on my right, or your right as well, I suppose. Yes. And as you can see, it's a hole in the ground, as I showed you previously. However, they would line the hole with plastic. They'd have these drainage sort of systems in place to collect any sort of fluids that might exist, and they would try to minimize how much of those fluids would leach into the underground system. So they try to contain it as much as possible. All of that costs money, hence capital intensive. The developed world can afford to pay for a more elaborate hole in the ground, whereas the developing world cannot. And so their way of dealing with garbage is, because they have an excess of labour, a lot of people who don't have jobs, a lot of people who are desperate just to earn an income just to survive, they just simply dump it in an area and then let people freely move about in there, trying to sort out anything that they find of value. So we as a brand, if we are to collect our garments back in this process of recycling, our customers bring it back to us, we have to make a choice as to which garbage tip we put it in. This nice, efficient, capital intensive one, or this the one in the developing world, which is not so pleasant when it comes to Kate Raworth's social economy, particularly health. Obviously, it can't be too healthy spending all day in a garbage tip. Um, and again, this just sort of reiterates the same point I was just making. However, what we're seeing a trend in the developed world with garbage is, if you look at these fees represent the price it costs to throw something away. So you're starting to see the developed world incorporate the cost of garbage into it. Remember I was saying before, under Adam Smith's model, you didn't have to think about garbage at all. It was just throw it away in a hole in the ground, that's it. Now you start to see that the cost being incorporated. In a country like Germany, for instance, these costs are actually embedded into, excuse the pun, embedded into the mattress, into its original retail price. So when you buy a mattress in Germany, or you buy a product in Germany, part of the price is the price to throw it away, even though it might be 10, 15, 20 years from now. They started doing that with cars. When you buy a car, it has a cost of disposal fee attached to it. So same thing you can do when you price garments, is you can have a recommended retail price, but also include into it a disposal cost. Customer doesn't need to know about it, it's just factored into the price. But you as a business are collecting money to pay for the disposal of that garment away. Just an idea that could be implemented in the future. So what's the problem with garbage anyway? What's the problem with having a big garbage tip? Basically, it stinks. Um, it creates methane, which is a greenhouse gas. Methane, along with CO2 emissions, impact climate change. Methane is actually much, much, much more damaging than CO2 emissions. We don't emit as much methane um, as we do CO2. However, it is a significant contributor, and it stays in the atmosphere a lot longer. So it's not a great gas to have up there. Uh, Remember, you've got the dyes from the garments as well. So they're in the garment, they're in the fibre. You stick it in the ground. As it decomposes, those dyes, those chemicals can leach, as I said before, into the soil and then eventually into the groundwater. A lot of the water on Earth is just underneath the ground. It goes out into river systems and such, so it can contaminate it as well. So they end up being toxic concentrations of waste because of the way in which we dump it. And what is it that we dump? Well, it's not just the garment when we're finished with it, but think about this. When we buy the garment, there might be these little clips, there might be a plastic bag that the garment comes in, there might be a swing tag, it has to be thrown away. There's these annoying bags, quite nice, but annoying in terms of their resource usage. Potentially the hanger, depending what you get, and even the invoice, which you tend to throw away. So with the purchase of a garment, there's also these other ancillaries that go with it, which have to be thrown away. And the question then is, and it might be a question on the test, is how do you minimize this stuff? Do you need all of these things to accompany the garment when you sell it, only for the customer to throw it away? Like in this little plastic pin, a clip, it has a single use. It gets used once. As soon as it gets home, the customer takes it off, chucks it straight in the bin. Possibly the same with that, definitely with the swing tags. We had one year a student suggested that the swing tags contain an educational component. Can't remember what it was. It had something to do with you could give the swing tag to your kid and maybe it was colouring in or something. Very clever idea because it meant, it had the brand on it. So you're actually educating the child to that particular brand as well as making it an activity for colouring in. So at least you get two uses out of that swing tag. Once as a swing tag, once as a child's activity. They're the kind of answers that's a kind of HD answer. It's very clever, simple but clever and effective answer. Okay,